Something that I wish would happen is that more people that hated Wayland went and deeply understood the current state of Wayland, went and found out its actual current shortcomings, and focused on those. Instead, what we get is constantly talking about problems that were solved years ago, problems that also exist on X11, and problems that never existed to begin with. And then sometimes, just ever so slightly, there are real issues that are brought up, but those get drowned out by all of the things that are not real. And that's basically what this is. The Wayland open letter. Please don't promote Wayland. This has some actual legitimate points. And then 90% of it is nonsense. The Wayland open letter. Please don't promote Wayland. Just like think twice before abandoning X11, Wayland breaks everything, every so often it brings up a real legitimate point that gets drowned out by things that are not real. Linux desktop usage sits at roughly 2 to 4% of the market. I've done a video on desktop usage before. There's no real good numbers, so we'll just take these, because this is what a lot of people say anyway. And this is why any major change, like the change from X11 to Wayland, or changing back from Wayland to X11, needs to be done with extreme care. We have a tiny fragmented ecosystem that desperately needs unity and stability to grow. Instead of consolidating around proven technology, the community is fracturing itself further with Wayland, a solution looking for a problem that creates more issues than it solves. If we were talking about 2010, I would agree that in many ways, Wayland should not be shipping to any regular users. Absolutely not. That's not where we are now. And I've done surveys on this plenty of times. The numbers keep going up. At least 70% of Linux users are on Wayland, and that number's not going down. The harsh reality of Linux desktop market share. About 3-ish% market share, dozens of distros, multiple desktop environments, and now a display server split. X11 versus Wayland fragmentation. We're kind of at the tail end of that now, and most people have migrated over to Wayland, or not even migrated in some cases. Their first experience using Linux was starting on Wayland, and they never saw a reason to go back. Application developers already struggle to justify supporting Linux given the tiny user base. This is absolutely true. Now we're asking to support multiple display servers with completely different capabilities and APIs. In most cases, applications can just support X11, and they will work just fine on X-Wayland. There are very few cases, very few exceptions, where there is a Wayland protocol they actually need to support. Also keep in mind, a lot of the time when you're supporting a Wayland protocol, this is going to be something done by the toolkit you are using. There are exceptions. Absolutely there are exceptions. But most of the time, you can just enable a Wayland build, and you have a Wayland build. Compare this to Windows or macOS. Developers target one platform with consistent APIs and behavior. Not really true. They target multiple versions of Windows and multiple versions of macOS. And macOS is a really good example because there was the period where you have both Intel Macs and Apple Silicon Macs. So you actually are seeing that fragmentation on those platforms as well. It's just not as pronounced as what you have on Linux with all of the different configurations you can have. On Linux, they now need to handle X11 with its decades of established APIs. This is actually a misnomer with X11. For complex applications, for things that are using their own custom toolkit, they've always had to worry about different desktop environments they're using. This isn't something where on X11 applications just always consistently worked across everything. Ask any toolkit developer, and they are going to tell you this. Multiple Wayland compositors, GNOME Shell, KDE, Kwin, Sway, Hyperlink, etc. In most cases, protocols are being shared between these environments, so it's basically the same state of things as X11. Where the problems tend to appear are when specific protocols are not being adopted by specific environments. Each compositor implementing different protocol extensions. Again, most of the really important protocol extensions are already adopted across all of the compositors. There are exceptions, there are absolutely exceptions, but also most of the extensions are used for internal functionality within the compositor, and you don't need to worry about that unless you're building a GNOME application, or a KDE application, or a Cosmic application. Different feature sets and capabilities across compositors. This has always been the case. This is nothing new on the Wayland side. It's exactly the same on the X11 side as well. Inconsistent behavior for the same operations. Once again, this has always been the case. These last 2 points aren't new to Linux whatsoever. The developer nightmare supporting a fragmented platform. So before Wayland with X11 only, one display server protocol to support. Technically, for most of Linux's life, this has been kind of true. This isn't inherent to X11, it's just inherent to the fact that nobody else wanted to make something to compete with Xorg. There are other implementations of X11 that do exist, mainly on other platforms though, like macOS, and when we moved from X3D6 on Linux into Xorg, that was a fork of the older project, and X3D6 kind of fell out of favor pretty quickly once Xorg came around. Consistent behavior across all Linux distributions. Yes, due to the fact that Xorg was basically feature frozen, so you didn't have a bunch of different versions that were constantly in deployment because versions just weren't being shipped out that quickly. When that was the case, you did definitely have inconsistent behavior across different distributions. Also, you still have inconsistent behavior based on your different desktop environments. Mature, stable APIs with decades of documentation, which also exists on the Wayland side as well. It is less mature, it is less decades, but the core Wayland protocols have been around for well over a decade at this point, and again, this is another thing where, because X11 was basically feature frozen, because Xorg was basically feature frozen, there weren't new things being added all the time. Feature parity with Windows/macOS for most cases. Sure, I'll give you most cases. Predictable window management and input handling. This is entirely tied to your window manager. This has literally nothing to do with X11. And input handling, it's predictable on Wayland as well because you're using the same libraries. After the Wayland adoption, multiple protocols. X11, Wayland plus compositor specific extensions. This already existed in the past, just in a different part of the stack. Different behavior across desktop environments also already existed in the past. Immature APIs with missing functionality. Yes, for the APIs, for the protocols that are newer, they are going to be immature. And there are absolutely places where functionality is still missing. I will totally grant you that, but also this is something that comes around from Wayland existing for longer, right? Like, naturally, anything that comes after X11 will be less mature than X11 because it is newer. Significant feature regressions compared to other platforms. In certain areas, absolutely. In other areas, there are things that X11 does not do, like mixed DPI, mixed variable refresh rate, HDR. All of these things are not supported on Xorg, but they are supported on Wayland. Complex fallback mechanisms and conditional code paths, which exist on Xorg as well, and testing matrix that's exponentially more complex. I don't know if exponentially is the correct word here, but sure, having to test more things is having to test more things. The result is that independent developers and small teams might just drop Linux support entirely. The easiest solution when the platform becomes too complex. In a lot of cases, the reason why they drop it is they weren't really Linux developers in the first place. They're not really Linux users. They have a Linux version. They made the Linux version 10 plus years ago, and it's never really caused a problem. And now that things are changing, they don't want to support it. This is absolutely a problem, and yes, any sort of migration would cause this. Also, any sort of major changes to Xorg would cause the exact same thing. They might support only X11, creating a poor experience for Wayland users. Not really a problem, because most applications will run totally fine under X Wayland. There are very small edge cases where this actually will create a bad experience. Support only one Wayland compositor. In many cases, that ends up just being GNOME. Now, this is true in some cases. However, much like Steam only supporting Ubuntu officially, There are cases where they say they only support GNOME, but the check for GNOME is an environment variable or a setting that you say, I'm on GNOME. They're not actually relying on GNOME features. It's just they've only tested it on GNOME and only automatically enable it on GNOME. Zoom being a prime example here. It works on everything else, but it doesn't automatically enable it. Or they might just ship broken/limited functionality. Good example of this being Discord for a very long time, but Discord had a solution that was available there. It's just the Linux team, frankly, I think there's just like one guy that works on it. But for Linux native software, for developers that exist within the Linux space, who maybe there is some functionality that they don't have, maybe there's something they really need, like ext zones, for example, I think Wayland developers should encourage app developers to get more involved in protocol discussions. I do agree that app developers should have more of a voting role within Wayland and actually be able to direct the course of the project, because there are solutions coming along that work in a vacuum or work within an environment, but for complex applications like an OBS or a Blender are just not at all suitable. Absolute prime example being the global shortcuts portal, which works for very simple cases like, oh, I want to do a push to talk, or like I want to have a couple of bindings, but is not at all suitable for the way that OBS functions with how many keys it has. The real world impact. Enterprise adoption. Organizations are hesitant to adopt Linux distributions that force Wayland due to compatibility concerns with existing workflows and applications. I would be very interested to know that if downloads of the latest version of RHEL, Rocky Linux, CentOS Stream, Alma Linux, Ubuntu, if those just suddenly people stopped using, because I have extreme doubts that this is the case. Also keep in mind that a lot of enterprise users never run the latest thing anyway. There is so much enterprise software out there that was written 20 years ago, and they will keep using it until the end of time. It has nothing to do with X11 or Wayland. It's they don't want to change anything because it works. Developer productivity. Developers are forced to spend time working around Wayland limitations instead of focusing on their actual projects. This is going to be the case on any platform you want to support. If you have an Android application and you want to port it to iOS, you will need to work around iOS limitations. If you have a Windows app and want to port it to Mac, you will need to work around macOS limitations. Now, in some cases, there are limitations on Wayland that cannot be overcome that do limit functionality. And in those cases, those are actual problems. But having to know different things to support a different platform, that's just how different platforms work. Also, not really relevant for most applications that will just work on Wayland, or will just work with the X11 version through X-Wayland. User experience. End users experience crashes. If they experience a crash that has nothing to do with Wayland, that is just buggy software. Missing features, sure, I'll give you that. And inconsistent behavior that didn't exist with X11. Weird way to phrase it, but yes, there will be missing features, and this is just saying there will be missing features twice. Hardware support. NVIDIA users face particular challenges, and many specialized hardware configurations simply don't work reliably. Now, NVIDIA is a problem, and has been a problem for a very long time. If you're using a post... is it 10 series? I think 10 series. Those should be fine on Wayland at this point. If you want to use the open source drivers, if you have a GSP firmware card or later, which I believe is 10 series or later, the open source drivers should be a much better experience now. But NVIDIA, yes, is absolutely a problem, but going forward should be considerably less of a problem as more people buy into these newer cards, even if they're buying, 3 or 4 generations back. If they are post the support point, things should generally be better. But if you're on, say, 600 series, yeah, your experience is going to be pretty bad. Missing core features. No global hotkeys. This is true. There is a portal. Applications aren't going to adopt it because it is simply just not viable for real-world use cases, and a lot of the momentum behind solving this issue is kinda gone now. So this is probably going to be a problem for the foreseeable future. No screen recording without permission dialogues. This is not a missing feature because screen recording does work. The thing that you don't have is screen recording without asking about screen recording. That's fine. It's just one more button to press. That's not a missing feature. Stop pretending it's a missing feature. Just because you need to use a portal doesn't mean it's a missing feature. No window positioning control. Applications cannot control where they appear on the screen. There is user control. You can do things like window rules and all that stuff. Any sensible environment is going to have window rules. But applications that want to place their windows where they want to place them, yes, this is still an issue. Things like ext zones are trying to solve this. It's just, there is a lot of cultural difference within Wayland that is making this a very difficult problem to solve. No reliable clipboard management. Clipboard data disappears when source application closes. There are clipboard managers that work well on Wayland. This is not a problem at all. Just pick any of the clipboard managers that work well. No window decorations protocol. Also not true. There is, just not on GNOME because GNOME wants to be special. I genuinely think the only other compositor that doesn't support it is GameScope because it just doesn't make sense in the context of GameScope. But just, if you want server-side decorations, just stop supporting GNOME, support literally anything else. Broken application categories, screen managers, and color pickers. I don't know what a screen manager is. I've tried to do a search for it, and I still cannot work out what that is trying to be. Color pickers absolutely do exist on Wayland, and have probably the entire time I've been using Wayland. This is not an issue. Automation tools. No way to programmatically control other applications. Yes and no. So you can do keyboard emulation and mouse emulation through something known as YDO tool. It doesn't have the level of control as XDO tool though. This is actually a problem, but also is a problem that KDE is trying to solve and is one of the reasons why they are not dropping X11 support yet. It is one of the things they want to solve before they go all in on Wayland. Window managers and desktop environments. Limited control over window management. I have no idea what this is supposed to be talking about. Maybe it's conflating this with the fact that there is no window positioning control protocol, but this is something on the application side. When we're talking about the window manager side, that's not a problem that exists. It so doesn't exist that because you control how your compositor works, you can even define new ways that windows are placed. You can make some weird VR compositor that couldn't ever remotely work under the X11 model. So this is just fluff nonsense. Accessibility software, screen readers and magnifiers often don't work properly. This is about 3 years out of date. Accessibility software has greatly improved. Now, there are issues outside of the major desktop environment. I will absolutely say that. But if we're talking about GNOME and KDE, there are new problems, but most of the people I've spoke to who rely on this software say that it is better now on Wayland. And remote desktop solutions, VNC, RDP, and similar tools have significant limitations. Again, quite a while ago, there are absolutely still issues with remoting into a system that you can't get someone to go and confirm the connection on. But once you have the connection, that basically isn't a problem anymore. Hardware and driver issues. We already talked about this one right here. Multi-GPU setups. Frankly, I don't think multi-GPU setups work good on anything. This isn't just a Wayland thing. This is just multi-GPU setups. Just all out. Older hardware. Many systems cannot run Wayland compositors effectively. A big reason for that is there's been a massive push towards doing hardware-accelerated applications. And if you have an older application that doesn't support modern APIs, well, you have problems there. But keep in mind, those same applications would have the same problems running on X11 as well. This is not a Wayland thing. This is newer software makes use of newer APIs. In some cases, that newer software is less optimized. That I'll absolutely say. But when it comes to using newer versions of Vulkan, yeah, it's just a problem that you're kind of going to have to deal with. Specialized input devices, graphics tablets, yes, I'll give you. Gaming controllers often have reduced functionality. This, I don't know what they read. This is not even remotely true. Graphics tablets, absolutely. And this is another part of the reason why KDE isn't dropping the X11 side yet, because there are certain edge cases where things don't work as well as people would want them to work. Compositor fragmentation. This one we talked about earlier, but feature availability varies. What worked in GNOME may not work in KDE or WRoots-based compositors. Performance differences. Same applications perform differently across different compositors, and configuration incompatibilities. No standardized way to configure compositor behavior. All of this is true on X11 and has literally always been true. These are not Wayland problems. These are Linux problems. These are problems with the fact that there is no singular desktop and things work differently. Wayland, a gigantic step backwards. I do want to focus on this one here. 2008 to present, 16 plus years of development and still missing core functionality that X11 has had for decades. I do think that especially early on, there was a lot of misguided ideas about what a Linux desktop should be, and a lot of protocols that should have been there from the start. I do think a positioning protocol is one of those. Just things like being able to let your screen tear, disabling the VSync. That is something that took a lot of effort to push through. Or, the idea that initially there was no generic way to capture your screen, and that didn't come along until Pipewire and Portals. These are things which should have been considered from the very start. However, most of these problems have been resolved, and whilst there are still issues like letting applications position themselves like global hotkeys, I do think in the past 4 or 5 years, things have moved in a very good direction. 2024 forced migration. Distributions start making incomplete Wayland the default, breaking countless workflows while X11 continues to be actively developed. I'll get to this point in a moment, but I do want to touch on this date as the forced migration, because that's not even remotely the case. So Fedora 25 back in 2016 with the GNOME session, and also AMD cards, that's when they defaulted to Wayland. Fedora KDE in 34 in 2021, they defaulted, and then Ubuntu 2104. The most recent one I can find is Kubuntu in 2504, and that's only because they took a really long time to adopt Plasma 6. So this has been happening a lot longer than 2024. And regarding actively developed, this is talking about Ex Libre. Now, I'm not entirely opposed to the project existing like some people in the FOSS space, but it does have a couple of notable problems. Firstly, you need to stick around for a long time before any major distro is even going to look at it, even going to remotely consider adopting it. It hasn't even been around for a full Ubuntu cycle yet. At least let it exist for 6 months. Better yet, at least let it exist for a year. Second problem is you need to get NVIDIA on board. If you can't get NVIDIA on board and make sure the drivers align with the ABI, you are not going to get any major distros to adopt it. There might be packages in like third-party repos, things like that, but it is not going to replace Xorg. You cannot have a combative relationship with NVIDIA. The primary justification for Wayland is security, but this is largely security theater. I would argue against it being the primary justification. It is certainly one of the justifications, and the value of it being a justification really depends on the individual person. Modern sandboxing doesn't require Wayland. Yes, of course, you don't need to be running Wayland. You don't even need a desktop environment to have a sandbox, but that depends on what we are talking about sandboxing. Sandbox does not just mean one individual thing, and that covers every single use case. Desktop users need functionality over isolation. This is true, and I think more people would benefit from less isolation of the functionality and more push towards having protocols that applications can use more in line with X11. However, if what we result in is permission-controlled protocols, That's still better than where we currently are at. Also, in many ways, this is more of a Flatpak problem than a general Wayland problem. Wayland breaks accessibility, again, I talked about that earlier, not really the case. Permission fatigue. This is something I did my own video on. This, I think, is a completely legitimate problem. As more applications start using portals, you're going to see more pop-ups asking for more permissions. And this is going to start getting annoying very quickly, especially with complex applications. There are ways to save permissions, and there is definitely work towards that direction. But I expect this problem to start feeling a lot worse before it starts getting better. False sense of security. Most attack vectors don't require X11 protocols. Yes, that's true, but some of them do. That's like saying, don't lock your car door because most people will break your window. It's like, sure, I guess, but that's not an argument against doing so. And X11 is actively maintained. Again, we talked about this. Yeah, it needs to be adopted by NVIDIA, and it needs to exist for longer before it's part of the conversation. It is good that X Libre is a thing that exists, but we need to give it time first. The performance myth. Another common claim is that Wayland provides better performance. On some configurations, it does. On others, X11 is better. Just like on some configurations, GNOME performs better, and others, KDE does. Also dependent on the version and other software you're running and a whole mix of things. And this is a lot of words to basically say sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. But I don't think it's ever really been something that anyone hyper fixates on. Best case scenario, it's like a few percent better. That is best case scenario. You're never talking about, oh, I go from 100 FPS to 200 FPS. No, that's just not what you're seeing. What you will generally see, though, is improved perceived smoothness due to VSync and a lack of tearing. Feature regression comparison. Again, having to click a button to confirm you want to do something is not a regression, that is a prompt. Window control, and you would have talked about this one before. Input management, basically talked about this. Remote access, also talked about this. It is wild to include this one though. Multi-monitor, X11, reliable, consistent behavior, Wayland, compositor dependent, often buggy. You have to have balls of steel to claim that multi-monitor support on X11 is better. It's not. Multi-monitor doesn't even exist on the X11 side. It is a very convenient hack that does a good enough job for simple configurations. But when we're talking about mixed DPI, mixed variable refresh rate, that doesn't work at all on X11. And then legacy support, backwards compatibility for decades. Wayland breaks legacy applications. Yes, in some cases, there are applications that do not work under Wayland. This is absolutely true. However, because Wayland literally is an X11 server, most of these applications will work perfectly fine, literally no issue. The only cases where things don't work fine are the edge cases, right? Like, you need to access some core functionality that is no longer present when we're talking about Wayland. How Wayland is damaging the Linux ecosystem. 1. Application developer exodus. That is a very extreme sounding word for a few developers here and there don't want to support it. Increased development costs. Supporting multiple display servers multiplies testing and development time. Yes, but also you're kind of overstating how much it is for most applications. Reduced feature parity. Applications have fewer features on Linux compared to Windows and macOS. There are cases where this is due to Wayland, But there's also a lot of applications where this is just due to the fact that this has always been the case, and this is actually not a new thing whatsoever. Support burden. Bug reports become more complex with multiple compositor variables. Again, they were already complex with multiple desktop environment variables and version variables, and yes, this is more complex, I will grant you that, but let's not pretend it was easy before. User confusion. It works on my Linux, but not on your scenarios, become more common. Can it really become any more common than it already was? Like, really? Enterprise resistance. Businesses are avoiding Linux desktop deployments because of workflow disruption. Critical business applications break under Wayland. Keep in mind, critical business applications also break under Linux in general. Yeah. And when we talk about applications where you can't have the application placed where its windows are going to go, yes, that is annoying, and yes, that is a problem, but the application still does function. So if for some reason, even with that being the case, they still desire to use Wayland, they still can use Wayland. Also, there is nothing stopping you just installing the Xorg package on that system if you really, really need it. Training costs. IT staff need to learn multiple compositor environments. If you are deploying things to your employees, well, you wouldn't be running multiple compositor environments, you would all put them on the same thing. Support complexity, this is the same thing. And vendor support. Commercial software vendors drop Linux support rather than deal with Wayland complexity. Again, in most cases, there is no additional complexity. There are cases where things don't work, but it is not every commercial application. It is not every application. It has never been every application. Most applications are not things like KiCad. That's not the state of things. Community fragmentation. Distro wars intensified. Choice of display server becomes a major differentiator. Is that not already the state we were always in with the choice of window manager or desktop environment? It might become like another variable you consider, but it's already the state things are in. Documentation fragmentation. Tutorials and guides need to cover multiple scenarios. Sure, there is another scenario, but they were already covering multiple with different distros anyway, and different desktop environments and window managers and all this stuff. Same thing with this point here. And developer energy wasted. Time spent on Wayland compatibility instead of new features. Sure, yes, if you support more things, you have to spend time supporting those things. Sure. Real-world casualties of Wayland adoption. OBS Studio has reduced functionality under Wayland. This, I hope, is referring to the browser docs, where under Wayland, because of CEF, they currently do not work. That is the Chromium embedded framework. For some reason or another, the dependency doesn't work properly under Wayland. This is something OBS wants to solve, but it's kinda out of their hands right now. Game streaming software often fails to capture screens. This is not true and hasn't been true for about 5 years now. Overlay applications don't work properly. I will give you that. This is absolutely the case. Many games have input or display issues. Any games that did already had those issues under X11. That is not specifically a Wayland problem. CAD applications lose window management capabilities. This is true in the cases of CAD applications that have window management capabilities. However, the issue I have here is this is framing it as if all of these tools need things like EXT zones to function. They don't, they never have, and they never will. The idea of having multiple windows for an application is a model that is kind of falling out of fashion, and most of the cases we are seeing are legacy applications that are still being supported. It is a small minority of applications that do need this. It is an important problem, but let's not pretend like it is every single thing that needs it. IDE features like global search hotkeys break. No. Just no. Screen annotation tools become unusable. There are screen annotation tools that exist on Wayland. Something like Grommet MPX works just fine. No issue whatsoever. Remote collaboration tools fail. Again, no. If you have remote desktop tooling or you have remote collaboration tools within your application, No. We've already talked about accessibility. This is quite out of date. We've basically covered all of these things before, and here we go. Here is an actual, okay, maybe not this one, and not this one, but these two here, these 2 points under creative work, these are legitimate points. There are issues with color management. There are issues with graphics tablets. Again, color pickers work, no issue. Screen recording also works, no issue. But these are, see, this is what I meant earlier, right? Like, when there are these actual crumbs of important issues surrounded by things that are not issues or were solved years ago. And then education and research is basically a repeat of the professional software section. And again, this is not true. This hasn't been true for about 5 years. Scientific software lose functionality, I assume, is referring to window placement. Yes, there are cases where it is like that, but also it's not every single one of them. Same thing here. This is literally just the same point twice. And then, sorry, it's the same point about 3 times in a row. This is the only different point. There was a better way. The Linux community didn't choose this path of fragmentation and regression. There are alternatives that could have addressed legitimate concerns without breaking everything. Evolutionary improvements to X11, security extensions, performance improvements, modern features, and gradual migration. What the author here is failing to realize is, yes, you would still be on X11, but you would have created the exact same problem you now have with Wayland. You're just calling it X11 instead. You would be adding these new features, removing old features, making these major changes, and you'd still have applications not porting to newer versions, not adopting this new functionality, and still breaking. It would just be breaking in a slightly different way. Linux containers and namespaces, namespace isolation, permission systems, and compatibility preservation. See, this is a nice thing to write down on paper, but when you start doing any of these major changes, you're going to cause regressions. You're going to break things, and I think it is a far better idea to have a clear idea that you're going to break things, right? Have X11 be feature frozen and then make major breaking changes on this new thing so that if you are supporting the new thing, you know exactly what you are supporting. You're not continuing to use the old thing and then things slowly, gradually over time cause regressions. You know you're going to a new thing, you know you're gonna have to deal with new problems, and you have a clear idea of what they're going to be. And as I touched on earlier, the only desktop pushing super hard to drop the X11 side is GNOME. It's going to be gone most likely in the next version unless something comes up. Next version, and then everything that ships that version is obviously going to have to follow suit unless they want to patch things back in. If you don't like that, stop supporting GNOME. It is not the desktop for you. No amount of open letters are going to change their mind. What you should do instead is support a project that is more aligned with your values. Support a project that is moving far more conservatively, that is trying to fix every single possible problem they can before they drop X11 support. Go support projects like KDE who want to get everything dealt with and make it as smooth of a migration as possible. There are no official plans to drop X11 support anytime soon, and honestly, I would be surprised if it happens during the Plasma 6 cycle. What we are asking for. This is why we ask respectfully that distributions and desktop environments stop making Wayland the default and continue to properly support X11. None of the developers are going to keep supporting it. They have decided that this is feature frozen because they want to improve Wayland as much as possible, and trying to support both platforms, as was brought up in this article, costs a lot of extra money, causes a lot of extra testing. So instead of trying to support both and support both badly, they have shifted their focus onto just improving Wayland. Though we could manually switch back to X11 on every system, we shouldn't have to. We believe that forcing Wayland adoption is premature when critical functionality is still missing and broken. I would have agreed with you 3 or 4 years ago. There were so many more things completely missing, and I have no idea why Fedora adopted it by default so quickly, right? Like, if we were trying to get rid of X11 back then, you would have killed the Linux desktop. But that's not where we are. Right now, most major issues have been resolved, And the issues that are left now are more just general annoyances or issues with niche use cases. For the majority of people who just open their browser, maybe do a bit of programming, do some gaming, we're basically there. And that's shown by the stats. The numbers don't lie. The problem we're facing is the assumption that Wayland is ready when it clearly isn't for many use cases. Until the ecosystem matures and reaches feature parity with X11, there is little justification for making it the default. I disagree with this point. Right now, it is at the point where for the majority of people, it is good enough. But you need more people testing it to find where these issues are, find where the edge cases are, which haven't really been properly tested yet, get more developers trying to get involved in the space and porting their applications over, and seeing where things need to be further improved upon. You need people involved in it to kind of make this happen. We don't have some corporate overlord that is developing everything behind closed doors. I know some people like to think, oh, IBM, Red Hat, that's our corporate overlord. That's just not the case. They're involved in projects like GNOME, and that's kind of like the major extent of it. And I know that some people might not like to hear this. I think it's okay that if you need X11 on your system, you should have to go and manually swap back yourself. When most people are on Wayland and most people seem to be happy, if we were to suddenly go and say, okay, well, we're taking everyone that is on Wayland right now and then moving them back to X11, that is going to cause major regressions in people's workflow. One of the issues we have here is people who really support X11 seem to think that going from X11 to Wayland is just a regression. But yes, there are regressions, absolutely. But going from Wayland back to X11 also causes just as many regressions. If you want to experiment with bleeding edge technology, that's fine with us. However, if you choose to use Wayland, you should be aware that you're in experimental territory. It's not 2016 anymore. Any issues you encounter should be reported to the Wayland developers, not the application developers who are being forced to support an incomplete platform. No, you should report it to both of them. You should mention to the Wayland developers, hey, this application has this issue. Is this something that Wayland can fix? Is this a problem with the application? Where is this an issue? And also report it to the application developers who may not actively be supporting Wayland. They have a Wayland build, they have a Linux version, but they don't actively use the platform and don't actively know what requirements they cannot meet on that platform. Specific actions we request. For distribution maintainers, keep X11 as the default session option. That boat long since sailed. Ensure X11 packages remain fully supported and updated. This is the case for most distros that do keep the X11 side around. For example, in KDE, the Wayland and X11 packages were split, and anything that has them now does keep them updated. To be fair, the X11 side doesn't really need to be updated anywhere near as much, though. Don't hide X11 options in login managers. If it is hiding it, that is a broken login manager, and that is clearly a bug. There was a possible choice to go down that route with GNOME. I am happy they decided against doing so. Provide clear documentation for switching back to X11. If they support it, yes, I agree that should be there. Test major applications on X11, not just Wayland. This does put you in a situation where you are forcing developers to try it on both systems when they might just have it there as a feature-frozen version. Should you make sure it is working if you are shipping it? Absolutely. If you are not shipping it by default, I think you can justify not doing as extensive testing. And don't remove X11 support without user consent. Now, the problem with this is you are always going to have at least one user who says, I still want that thing to be around. And frankly, you can't build a distribution around one loud person. For desktop environment developers, continue investing in X11 compatibility and performance. That's just not going to happen, right? That's just not going to happen. They are focused on improving Wayland. Don't assume all users want Wayland. And that's why desktops that are being conservative are keeping both around. GNOME, is GNOME, stop using GNOME. Provide feature parity between X11 and Wayland session. This is technically impossible. There is absolutely no way to do this, just as there are issues with supporting X11 features on Wayland. There are Wayland features that cannot be supported on X11. This is just making it impossible to develop. Fix X11 bugs instead of just saying use Wayland. Most desktops like KDE have said X11 is not our focus, and unless you're willing to pay them, they are going to prioritize the thing that they want to prioritize. You cannot force developers to do work that they don't want to do. Make Wayland truly optional, not just technically available. Again, in KDE, it is still truly optional. You don't have to use it. Again, stop supporting GNOME if you don't like that direction. Document the feature differences clearly. This I fully agree with. If there are functionality differences, make sure they're explained so users don't go and bug you with bug reports about it. For application developers, don't drop X11 support just because Wayland exists. I can't think of any major application that has done this. There are applications that only work on Wayland, but most of those were made specifically from the start with Wayland in mind. If somebody knows of one, I would definitely like to hear about it. Test your applications thoroughly on X11. Sure, I agree that if you are developing an individual application, you probably should test it, especially if you're going to say you support that thing. Document which features require X11. In the same vein, you should do the opposite as well. Document which features require Wayland. Documentation is always good. Provide fallback mechanisms when Wayland lacks features. That fallback mechanism would just be running the X11 version, which is something that you can just tell an application to do. You don't need to provide fallback mechanisms for that. That's just a thing that exists. Don't assume Wayland will just work for your users. Sure, I guess. If you say you support X11, you specifically mention you are supporting it, you should actually support it. Support both display servers properly, or choose the more stable one. I will say, in a lot of cases, you don't need a Wayland build for your application. You can just get away with using X-Wayland, and that's probably going to be fine. Again, there are some minor improvements, and there are protocols you might want to rely on Wayland, but if it's like a text editor or a calculator, it frankly doesn't matter. I'm not going to focus on this, but I do want to bring up these just random imaginary costs. Testing Matrix Explosion costs $50,000 to $200,000 more. Where did that number come from? 6 to 18 months of migration delays, 2 to 3 times longer development time, 40 to 60% support burden. I don't know if this is just AI generated or this is just gibberish, because there is no source for any of these numbers. To distribution maintainers, you're hurting Linux. If you are a distribution that makes Linux the default, which is most of the major ones at this point, please reconsider this decision. Forcing users onto an incomplete display server without proper fallbacks is reckless and would be unacceptable on any other platform. They do have a fallback, except in the case of using GNOME. Again, stop using GNOME, go use KDE, and make use of the X11 session. That is your fallback. Your actions are hurting developers and users who depend on stable, working systems. I do agree that it was reckless when Fedora did it about a decade ago. I don't think that's where we are anymore. We understand the desire to be on the cutting edge. However, we urge you to find ways to innovate without breaking existing functionality. You're not forcing Wayland on proprietary applications like Steam, Discord, or Chrome. They simply won't work anymore. All of these applications work on Wayland. Literally every single one of these applications works on Wayland. In fact, Discord actually supports screen sharing on Wayland now. Steam, with Proton, is working on getting native Wayland Wine working, and then Chrome's not an issue at all. Like, this is of all the applications you could have picked, you picked 3 applications that work amazingly on Wayland. The only one that has an issue is Discord and Push to Talk. That is the only one with a problem. Hey, decisions impact the ecosystem. When you make Wayland default, you have all of these things that go wrong, but the issue is if you revert this now, you're gonna have all of these problems in a different direction. Again, going from Wayland back to X11 isn't just entirely good. There are regressions. There might not be regressions in your workflow because you have a workflow built around X11. But when you have one built around Wayland, it is just as disruptive to go in the other direction. Here is when Wayland might be ready. Feature parity. I do agree that most things should be feature parity. However, there are things that Xorg can do and X11 can do that should stay in the past, that don't need to be brought forward because they don't belong in a display server. Application compatibility, 95% of common applications work without reduced functionality. Well, lucky for you, that's exactly where we are right now. Hardware support, reliable operation across all major hardware configurations. Luckily for you, that's also where we're at. Minus older NVIDIA cards. Compositor standardization. Consistent behavior across all major Wayland compositors. Well, luckily for you, that's where we're at. Minus, again, niche edge case applications which haven't been dealt with yet. Enterprise ready. Management tools, remote access, and workflow automation working. Most of the way there, this is a problem. There are some not perfect things, remote access, and management tools, yeah, that's not even related to Wayland. Community consensus, yeah, good luck with that one. Yeah, you're never gonna get that one. The protocol extension nightmare. Optional extensions mean broken applications. WLR screen copy, only supported in WL-root-based compositors. Well, luckily, we have a support matrix. Let's search for screen copy. Right here, WLR screen copy. Not true. So, it is supported in WL-roots, Sway right here, Hyperland, which is not based on WL-roots, Neri, which is based on Smithy. It is also supported in Mir, which is its own separate thing, and Louvre, which is its own separate thing as well. So, this statement is factually untrue. KDE server decoration. KDE specific ignored by GNOME. So, again, let's search for that. Server decoration, KDE server decoration. It is true, it is ignored by Mudder, which is GNOME. But it is not KDE specific, as can be seen by the things it is supported on that are not KDE, like Cosmic, like Sway, which is WL-roots, like Hyperland, which is also WL-roots. It is not on Mir. But again, this is not the statement, it is KDE specific. GTK shell, GNOME specific, rejected by other compositors. Let's search for that one. That one is true, except for Wayfire for some reason. I don't know why. This is very much a GNOME specific protocol though. An idle inhibit, inconsistently implemented across compositors. Here's the protocol right here, and it is supported across everything except Western, which doesn't implement anything, and GameScope, which is a very specific kind of compositor. So, not true. Real examples of compositor control. GNOME's Iron Fist. Again, if you don't like the things that GNOME does, just stop using GNOME, stop supporting GNOME. Go support things which agree with the direction that you want to take things. These two right here aren't Wayland related. Yeah, this is not like a Wayland problem at all. Yes, these two are issues, and yes, GNOME people were involved in rejecting them. Sure, I'll give you those ones. KDE's selective implementation. Some GNOME-originated protocols are ignored. I like the explanation of some, because this is not true if you say all of them, and the some that are rejected are GNOME-specific protocols that don't make sense in KDE. KDE doesn't just ignore GNOME-originated protocols because they came from GNOME. That's just not how that works. KDE-specific protocols don't work elsewhere. Yes, if they are KDE-specific protocols that only make sense in KDE, no one else adopts them. But in many other cases, as we saw literally from the support matrix, not true. Just check the support matrix. Features work differently than they do under X11. Well, yeah, sure. They also work differently than they do under GNOME. Sure, that's true. Applications must detect and work around KDE-specific behaviors. Again, also true on the X11 side. Sway/WL-roots fragmentation. These are not the same things. Sway is an implementation. WL-roots is the library that Sway is based on. each compositor interprets protocols slightly differently. Yes, because wroots is a library, and if they don't use functions of the library, then the library functions will not be available in the compositor. That is how libraries work. That is how libraries inherently work. Some features work in Sway, but not Hyperland. Well, Hyperland is not based on wroots, so that would make a lot of sense. Configuration options vary between compositors. Of course, because they are not the same desktop. Configuration options differ between i3 and DWM, or DWM and AwesomeWM, because they are not the same thing. Bug fixes in one don't automatically apply to others. Again, bug fixes in i3 don't apply to AwesomeWM. This is not a Wayland thing, this is a thing with not using the same software as another piece of software. How proper governance should work. Application-centric design. Okay, now we are back to things that are actually good. Yes, I do agree that apps should be much more involved in protocol design than they have been in the past. Mandatory core features. Yes, I agree there should be a mandatory protocol set. Developer representation. Again, such a good point. Backwards compatibility. Not entirely fully on board, but I do agree that just changing things for the sake of them being on Wayland isn't necessarily a good thing, and I think having applications in the protocol design process from the start would have led to more of this. User-focused priorities. Yes, absolutely. Consistent implementation. Yes, oh my god, like, we had such a yap of a post. Like, most of this post is just yap, features that are fixed, features that were never a problem, like, all of this stuff. And then, right near the bottom, this is when we finally get to a point that actually makes a valid argument. If this post removed 90% of the fluff and just focused on really clear points like this, no, it wouldn't get anywhere. But at least it would be focused and on point, talking about real problems that need to be addressed, trying to make an improvement. Because right now, kind of what this is like an ad for Ex Libre and a bunch of things that are not problems, except the one or two things that are mentioned that actually are problems. So I think that's where we're going to end it, because it has these signatories, but like they're not real and there's nowhere to actually sign it. So it's a open letter, but like not really. But it's been going around a bunch. People have been talking about it, and I just had to talk about it. I've been recording this video for a bit over 2 hours now. I am going to stop. I'm going to go edit the video. It's going to take a while. And yeah, none of this video is to say that Wayland is perfect. None of this is to say that there are no problems that need to be addressed. But I think anyone that has issues with Wayland, do yourself a favor and try it. Don't just listen to what other people have said and say, oh, it's bad because I read a thing online. Go and install it. Whether it be Hyperland or the Wayland session of whatever environment you like, go and install it, see what it's like, and get a first-hand experience for it, and see if the problems you think are problems are actually things that affect you. Anyway, if you liked the video, if you stuck around to the end, go like the video, go subscribe, all that cool stuff. I don't know how long this video is. Looking at my number of clips here, it's probably gonna be a big one. Anyway, if you're a like video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to LiberaPay, linked in the description down below. Videos like this take a long time to record and a long time to get through, so I'd very much appreciate that. And yeah, that's gonna be it for me, so see you guys later.